Welcome to this reading of an excerpt from the book These Truths, A History of the United States by historian Jill Lepore of Yale University, published in 2018. This section is Slavery and Liberty, or Liberty and Slavery. Benjamin Lay stood barely over 4 feet tall, hunchbacked and bowed, with a too big head and a barrel chest, and legs so spindly it did not appear possible that they could bear his weight. As a boy in England, he'd worked on his brother's farm before being apprenticed to a glove maker, shearing and stitching skins. At 21, he went to sea. In his hammock, by the light of a tallow candle, he read books. Lay liked to call himself a, quote, poor common sailor and an illiterate man. But in truth, he was widely read and well-traveled. He sailed to Syria and to Turkey, where he met 4 men that had been 17 years slaves, Englishmen who'd been enslaved by Muslims. He swabbed decks with men who'd sailed on English slave trading ships, carrying Africans. He'd heard tales of dark and terrible cruelties. In 1718, Lay sailed to Barbados, where he saw people branded and tortured and beaten, starved and broken. He decided that everything about this arrangement was an offense against God, who did not make others to be slaves to us. Barbados is in the Caribbean. It's a sugar colony plantation area. Lay and his also hobbled wife, a Quaker preacher with a crooked back, left Barbados after only 18 months and returned to England. In 1732, they embarked for Pennsylvania to join William Penn's Holy Experiment as fellow Quakers. Lay traveled from town to town and from colony to colony, only ever on foot, for he would not spur or use the the pointy things that you poke into a horse to make it go. Anyway, he's only ever on foot to denounce slavery before governors and ministers and merchants. What a parcel of hypocrites and deceivers we are, he said. His arguments against slavery fell on deaf ears. Then Lay became a hermit. Outside of Philadelphia, he carved a cave out of a hill. Inside, he stowed his library, 200 books of theology, biography, poetry, and history. He decided to protest slavery by refusing to eat or drink or wear or use anything that had been made with forced labor. He also refused to eat animals. He lived on water and milk, roasted turnips and honey. He kept bees and spun flax and stitched clothes. Benjamin Franklin used to visit him in his cave. Franklin at the time owned a, quote, Negro boy named Joseph. By 1750, he owned 2 more slaves, Peter and Jemina, husband and wife. Benjamin Lay pressed him and pressed him. By what right do you enslave these people? The American Revolution did not begin in 1775, and it didn't end when the war was over. There was not one, but 2 American revolutions at the end of the 1700s, the struggle for independence from Britain and the struggle to end slavery. Only one was won. The French and Indian War was a war over the trade in the East Indies, over fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, over shipping along the Mississippi River, and over sugar plantations on West Indian islands. Like all wars, its costs were borne most heavily by the poor, who did the fighting, while traders, who sold the weapons and supplied the soldiers, saw profits. War is declared in England, universal joy among the merchants, wrote one New Yorker in 1756. The colonists called it the French and Indian War, after the people they were fighting in North America. But the war stretched from Bengal in India to Barbados in the Caribbean, drew in Austria, Portugal, Prussia, eventually becomes Germany, kind of, Spain, and Russia, and engaged armies and navies in the Atlantic and the Pacific, in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. The French and Indian War brought Britain's North American colonies together. Along the way, the British troops plundered the people in the colonies. Before long, many colonists found themselves fearing the British army as much as the French. This was enough to put us out of conceit of such defenders, if we had really wanted any, wrote Franklin bitterly. Parliament promised the colonies the war would be fought at His Majesty's expense. The king would pay for it. It was the breaking of that promise and the laying of new taxes on the colonies that would, in the end, lead the colonists to break with England. Even before then, the most expensive war in history cost Britain the loyalty of its North American colonists. British troops plundered colonial homes and raided colonial farms. In Massachusetts, 1 in every 3 men served in the French and Indian War, whether they were penniless clerks or rich merchants. In any case, differences of title and rank that existed in Britain did not exist in the colonies, at least among free men. In England, fewer than 1 in 5 adult men could vote. In the colonies, that proportion was 2/3. The property requirements for voting were met by so many men that Thomas Hutchinson, who lost a bid to become governor in 1749, complained that the town of Boston was an absolute democracy. Quote, "There is more equality of rank and fortune in America than in any other country under the sun," South Carolina Governor Charles Pinckney declared. This was true so long as no one figured in that calculation, as Pinckney never would, people who were property, a number that included Pinckney's 45 slaves at Snee Farm, 55 people who constituted the source of his family's wealth. Among them were Cyrus, a carpenter, valued by Pinckney at 120 pounds. Cyrus's children, Charlotte, 80 pounds, Sam, 40 pounds, and Bella, 20 pounds. His granddaughter, Kate, 70 pounds, and a very old woman named Joan, who might have been Cyrus's mother. Pinckney placed the value of this great-grandmother at 0. She was, to him, worthless. Ooh, disturbing to see people categorized by the amount of money they're worth. In 1759, British and American forces defeated the French in Quebec, a stunning victory that led the Iroquois Confederacy to abandon their long-standing position of neutrality and join with the English, which turned the tide of the war. Weeks later, young George III was crowned King of Great Britain. 22 and strangely shy, he was a boy of a man, dressed in gold, his white buckled shoes tripping on a train of ermine. He presented himself to an uneasy world as a defender of the Protestant faith and of English liberties. He had declared as Prince of Wales, quote, "The pride, the glory of Britain, and the direct end of its constitution is political liberty." But by now, while his subjects in North America welcomed the coronation of their new king, they might as easily have recalled the wisdom of a proverb that Benjamin Franklin had written 20 years earlier in Poor Richard's Almanac. Quote, "The greatest monarch on the proudest throne is obliged to sit upon his own arse." It's pretty funny. Well done, Franklin. Arse, well, you can look that up. "We in America have certainly abundant reason to rejoice," the leading Massachusetts lawyer James Otis Jr. wrote from Boston in 1763. "The British dominion and power may now be said literally to expand from sea to sea, and from the great river to the ends of the earth." If the war had strained the colonists' relationship to the empire, the peace had strengthened both the empire and the colonists' attachment to it. Added Otis, "The true interest of Great Britain and her plantations, aka the colonies, are mutual, and what God in his providence has united, let no man dare attempt to pull asunder." LOL, that's what he's saying in 1763. Just a few years later, we get a revolution. In 1764, to pay the war debt and fund the defense of the colonies, Parliament passed the American Revenue Act, also known as the Sugar Act. Up until 1764, the colonial assemblies had raised their own taxes. Parliament had regulated trade. When Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which chiefly required stricter enforcement of earlier measures, some colonists challenged it by arguing that because the colonies had no representatives in Parliament, Parliament had no right to levy taxes on them. The Sugar Act wasn't radical. The response to it was radical, a consequence of the growing power of colonial assemblies at a time when the idea of representation was gaining new force. Taxes are what people pay to a ruler, to keep order and defend the realm. In the ancient world, landowners paid in crops or livestock, the landless with their labor. Levying taxes made medieval European monarchs rich. Only in the 1600s did monarchs begin to cede the power, that means give the power, to tax to legislatures, aka Parliament. Taxation became tied to representation at the very time that England was founding colonies in North America and the Caribbean, which was also the moment at which the English had begun to dominate the slave trade. In the 1760s, the two became muddled, rhetorically speaking. Massachusetts Assemblyman Samuel Adams asked, "If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves?" Taxation without representation, men like Adams argued, is rule by force, and rule by force is slavery. Okay. A 1765 Stamp Act required placing government-issued paper stamps on all manner of printed paper, from bills of credit to playing cards. Stamps were required across the British Empire, and by those standards, the tax levied in the colonies was cheap. Colonists paid only 2/3 of what Britons, people in England, paid. But the credit-strained mainland colonies, this proved difficult to bear. Opponents of the act began styling themselves as the Sons of Liberty, after the Sons of Liberty in 1750s Ireland, and describing themselves as rebelling against slavery. Not real slavery here, but rhetorical slavery, which is paying taxes. A creditor was, quote, the lord of another man's purse. Hadn't British creditors and Parliament itself swindled North American debtors of their purses and their liberty too? Was not Parliament making them slaves? John Adams, a 29-year-old Boston lawyer and leader of the Stamp Act opposition, wrote, quote, "We won't be their Negroes." Obviously, this is not a term that we use today, but it's a term that was used quite a bit at the time. The colonies were bound up in a growing credit crisis that would engulf the whole of the British Empire, from Virginia planters to Scottish bankers to East India Company tea exporters. But there were American particulars too. With the Stamp Act, a tax on all printed paper, including newspapers, Parliament levied a tax that cost the most to the people best able to complain about it, the printers of newspapers. Quote, "It will affect printers more than anybody," Benjamin Franklin, a printer, warned, begging Parliament to reconsider. Printers from Boston to Charleston argued that Parliament was trying to reduce the colonists to a state of slavery by destroying the freedom of the press. The printers of the Boston Gazette refused to buy stamps and changed the paper's motto to, quote, "A free press maintains the majesty of the people." In October, the month before the Stamp Act was to take effect, 27 delegates from 9 colonies met in a Stamp Act Congress in New York City Hall, where John Peter Zenger had been tried in 1735 and Caesar in 1741. The Stamp Act Congress collectively declared that, quote, "It is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. The sovereignty of the people," that means the people controlling themselves, "the freedom of the press, the relationship between representation and taxation, debt as slavery," each of these ideas, with origins in England, found a place in the colonists' opposition to the Stamp Act. Still, Parliament professed itself baffled. In 1766, Benjamin Franklin appeared before the House of Commons in Parliament to explain the colonists' refusal to pay the tax. At age 60, Franklin presented himself as once a man of the world and an American provincial, widely and plain-spoken, sophisticated and homespun. In what light did the people of America use to consider the Parliament of Great Britain? The ministers asked. Franklin says, "They considered the Parliament as the great bulwark and security of their liberties and privileges, and always spoke of it with the utmost respect and veneration." And have they not still the same respect for Parliament? No, it is greatly lessened. If the colonists had lost respect for Parliament, why had this come to pass? On what grounds did they object to the Stamp Act? Franklin cited their understanding of the common rights of Englishmen. What used to be the pride of the Americans, Parliament wanted to know? To indulge in the fashions and manufactures of Great Britain. What now is their pride? To wear their old clothes over again till they can make new ones. So they're not buying the goods of Great Britain anymore. They're not buying those manufactured cotton textiles. And yet this defiance did not extend to Quebec, the new province that Britain gets from the French and Indian War, taking over Canada, or to the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, where the burden of the Stamp Act was actually heavier. 13 colonies eventually cast off British rule. Some 13 more did not. Colonists from the mainland staged protests, formed a congress, and refused to pay the Stamp Act. But, except for some vague and half-hearted objections expressed on Nevis and St. Kitts, British planters in the West Indies barely uttered a complaint. South Carolina, whose economy had more in common with the British West Indies than with the mainland colonies, wavered. South Carolina almost went for the British. Boo. South Carolina always has bad opinions. Actually, that's a pretty radical statement to make. Never mind. South Carolina usually has bad opinions. Yeah, I don't know. That's a tricky one. We'll see throughout American history, South Carolina's. There's going to be some bad opinions that come out of South Carolina, I guess. Anyway, they were too worried about the possibility of inciting yet another slave rebellion. On the mainland, whites outnumbered blacks 4-1. On the islands, blacks outnumbered whites 8-1. 1/4 of all British troops in British America were stationed in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, where they protected English colonists from the ever-present threat of slave rebellion. For this protection, West Indian planters were more than willing to pay a tax on stamps. Planters in Jamaica were still reeling from the latest insurrection. That's a rebellion. You know what an insurrection is. In 1760, when an Akan man named Tacky had led hundreds of armed men who burned plantations and killed some 60 slave owners before they were captured. The reprisals, the retribution, the consequence, had been ferocious. Tacky's head was impaled on a stake, and, as in New York in 1741, some of his followers were hung in chains while others were burned at the stake. And still, the rebellions, they continued, for which island planters began to blame colonists on the mainland. Did the Sons of Liberty realize what they were saying? Quote, "Can you be surprised that the Negroes in Jamaica should endeavor to recover their freedom?" One merchant fumed. Quote, "When they daily hear at the tables of their masters how much the Americans are applauded for the stand they are making for theirs?" Unsurprisingly, the island's planters' unwillingness to join the protests against the Stamp Act greatly frustrated the Sons of Liberty in Boston. Quote, "Their Negroes seem to have more of the spirit of liberty than they," John Adams complained, asking, quote, "Can no punishment be devised for Barbados and Port Royal in Jamaica?" Adams was the rare man whose soaring ambition matched his talents. He would learn to restrain his passions better. But in the 1760s, his anger at those who refused to support the resistance was unchecked. The punishment of the Sons of Liberty decided upon came in the form of a boycott of Caribbean goods. In language even more heated than Adams, Patriot printers damned the, quote, "slavish islands of Barbados and Antigua, poor, mean-spirited, cowardly, dastardly Creoles." Creoles are, it's a term related to the racial hierarchies that are set up by Spain in their colonies in the New World. Creoles are usually people who were descendants of Europeans coming to the New World. For their, quote, "base desertion of the cause of liberty, their tame surrender of the rights of Britons, their mean, timid resignation to slavery." All this, of course, very wildly ironic. Some wealthy planters in the West Indies began to consider their northern neighbors to be mere blusterers. Quote, "I look at them as dogs that will bark but dare not stand," complained one planter from Jamaica. Nor were the West Indian planters wrong to worry that one kind of rebellion would incite another. In Charleston, that's in South Carolina, the Sons of Liberty marched to the streets, chanting "Liberty" and "No stamps," only to be followed by enslaved people crying "Liberty, liberty." And not a few Sons of Liberty made this same leap, from fighting for their own liberty to fighting to end slavery. Quote, "The colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black," James Otis Jr. insisted in a searing tract called The Rights of the British Colonists, published in 1764, only months after he had rejoiced about the growth of Britain's empire. Brilliant and unstable, Otis would later lose his mind. But in the 1760s, he, better than any of his contemporaries, saw the logical extension of arguments about natural rights. He found it absurd to suggest that it could be, quote, "right to enslave a man because he is black, or because he has short curled hair like wool." Slavery, Otis insisted, quote, "is the most shocking violation of the law of nature, and a source of political contamination, too. Quote, those who every day barter away another man's liberty will soon care little for their own," he warned. Otis's readers picked and chose which parts of his treaty to hold close and which parts to shed. But something had been set loose in the world, a set of unruly ideas about liberty, equality, and sovereignty, the rights of the people. In 1763, when Benjamin Franklin visited a school for black children, he admitted that his mind had changed. Quote, "I have conceived a higher opinion of the natural capacities of the black race that I had ever before entertained," he wrote to a friend. In Virginia, George Mason began to have doubts about slavery, sending to George Washington in December of 1765 an essay in which he argued that slavery was the, quote, "primary cause of the destruction of the most flourishing government that had ever existed, the Roman Republic, and warning that it might be the destruction of the British Empire, too." Debt, taxes, and slavery weren't the only issues raised in the political debates of the 1760s. The intensity of the debate strengthened new ideas about equality, too. Male and female are all one in Christ the truth, Benjamin Lay had argued, expressing an idea that drew on a wealth of 17th century Quaker writings about spiritual equality. Quote, "Are not women born as free as men?" Otis asked. Pamphleteers began arguing for a colony-wide anti-slavery law. Others counseled waiting until the end of the battle with Parliament, because even as it repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament had passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to make laws in all cases whatsoever. The next year, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, taxes on lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea. When this, too, led to riots and boycotts, the Prime Minister sent to Boston 2 regiments of the British Army to enforce the law. When troops fired into a crowd in March of 1770, killing 5 men, the Sons of Liberty called it a massacre and cried for relief from the tyranny of a standing army. But on the islands, in the West Indies, planters called not for less military presence, but more. The Colonial Assembly on St. Kitts begging the king to send troops to protect the colonists from the, quote, "turbulent and savage dispositions of the Negroes, ever prone to riots and rebellions." So 2 very different societies, one in the mainland colonies, in the places that rebel, and one on the islands in the Caribbean. One is much, much more reliant on enslaved people for labor. And those places, they don't rebel against Britain. And still, the zeal for liberty raised the question of ending slavery. Boston people will be angry with me for pronouncing this wrong, but I think it's like Worcester. The Worcester town meeting called for a law prohibiting the importing and buying of slaves. By 1766, an anti-slavery bill had been introduced into the Massachusetts Assembly. But, mindful of how the question of slavery had severed the island colonies from the mainland, many in Massachusetts feared that further anti-slavery sentiment would sever the northern colonies from the southern. Quote, "If passed into an act, it should have a bad effect on the union of the colonies," one assemblyman wrote to John Adams in 1771 when the bill came up for a vote. Because again, the economies of these colonies are different. The northern colonies are less reliant on slavery than the southern ones are. That'll come up again in American history, for sure. The next year, the Court of King's Bench in London took up the case of Somerset versus Stuart. Charles Stuart, a British customs officer in Boston, had purchased an African man named James Somerset. When Stuart was recalled to England in 1769, he brought Somerset with him. Somerset escaped, but was recaptured. Stuart, deciding to sell him to Jamaica, had him imprisoned on a ship. Somerset's friends brought the case to court, where the justice, or judge, Lord Mansfield, found that nothing in English common law supported Stuart's position. Somerset was set free. The Somerset case taught people held in slavery two lessons. First, they might look to the courts to secure their freedom. And second, they had a better shot at winning it in Britain than in any of its colonies. They began to act. Relying on the same logic that James Otis Jr. had expounded, they petitioned the courts for their freedom. Quote, "We expect great things from men who have made such a noble stand against the designs of their fellow men to enslave them," read a petition filed by 4 black men in Boston in April 1773. And they tried to escape to England. In Virginia that September, a slave couple ran away, hoping to secure their freedom by reaching London, holding, as one observer put it, quote, "a notion now too prevalent among the Negroes." This struggle for liberty was lost, as the colonists returned instead to their battles with Parliament. The London-based East India Company was at risk of bankruptcy, partly due to the colonial boycott, but more due to a famine in Bengal in India. The military costs it incurred ruling India, and collapsing stock value, consequent to the empire-wide credit crash of 1772. In May of 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which reduced the tax on tea, as a way of saving the East India Company, but again asserted Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Townspeople in Philadelphia called anyone who imported the tea an enemy of the country. Tea agents resigned their posts in fear. That fall, 3 ships loaded with tea arrived in Boston. On the night of December 16th, dozens of colonists disguised as Mohawks, warring Indians, boarded the boats and dumped chests of the tea into the harbor. To punish the city, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston Harbor and annulled the Massachusetts Charter, effective in June of 1774. In Virginia, James Madison Jr., 23, eyed the events in Massachusetts from Montpelier, his family's plantation in the Piedmont, east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He'd graduated from Princeton 2 years before and was home tutoring his younger siblings. Far from the scene of action, he followed the news avidly and took pains to understand why the response to the tea tax was different in the northern and middle colonies than it was in the southern colonies. At Princeton, a Presbyterian college, a college of dissenting faith, he made a study of religious liberty. And, after the dumping of the tea, he concluded that Massachusetts and Pennsylvania had resisted parliamentary authority in a way that Virginia did not, because the more northern colonies had no established religion. Religious liberty, Madison came to believe, is a good in itself, because it promotes an independence of the mind, but also because it makes possible political liberty. Hearing word of the Coercive Acts, he began to think, for the first time, of war. He wrote to his closest friend, William Bradford, in Philadelphia, and asked him whether it might not be best to, quote, "as soon as possible to begin our defense." Against who? Against Britain. But if protests over the Stamp Act had temporarily united the colonies, the Coercive Acts appeared to many delegates to be merely Massachusetts' problem. To Virginians, the delegates from Massachusetts seemed intemperate and rash, fanatical even, especially when they suggested the possibility of an eventual independence from Britain. In October, Washington expressed relief when, after speaking to the Boston people, he felt confident that he could, quote, again, this is George Washington saying this, "announce it as a fact, that it is not the wish or interest of that government, Massachusetts, Boston, or any other upon this continent, separately or collectively, to be set up for independency. He was, as sure as I can be of my existence, that no such thing, that is, independence from Great Britain, is desired by any thinking man in all of North America. LOL. From Philadelphia, James Madison's friend, William Bradford, passed along fascinating tidbits of gossip about the goings-on at Congress. Bradford proved a resourceful reporter and a better sleuth. From the librarian at the Library Company of Philadelphia, which supplied Congress with books, he heard that the delegates were busy reading Locke, John Locke, and Montesquieu, another Enlightenment philosopher, leading Bradford to reassure Madison, quote, "We may conjecture that their measures of Congress will be wisely planned, since they debate on them like philosophers." Wise they may have been, but these philosophers immediately confronted a very difficult question that has dogged the Union ever since. Congress was meant to be a representative body. How would representation be calculated? Virginia delegate Patrick Henry, an irresistible orator with a blistering stare, suggested that the delegates cast a number of votes proportionate to their colony's number of white inhabitants. Given the absence of any accurate population figures, the delegates had little choice but to do something far simpler, to grant each colony one vote. In any case, the point of meeting was to become something more than a collection of colonies and the sum of their grievances, a new body politic. Quote, "The distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders is no more," Henry said. "I am not a Virginian, but an American." This new Continental Congress agreed to boycott all British imports and ban all trade with the West Indies, a severing of ties with the islands. The month the boycott was to begin, the Jamaica Assembly sent a petition to the king with a bow and a curtsy. The Jamaicans began with the assurance that the island had no intention of joining the rebellion. Quote, "Weak and feeble as this colony of Jamaica is, from its very small number of white inhabitants, and its peculiar situation from the encumbrance of more than 200,000 slaves, it cannot be supposed that we now intend, or ever could have intended, resistance to Great Britain," the Jamaicans explained. And yet, they went on. They did agree with the Continentals' fundamental grievance, declaring it, quote, "the first established principle of the Constitution, that the people of England have the right to partake, and do partake, in the legislation of their country." Unmoved, the Continental Congress offered Jamaica half-hearted thanks. Quote, "We feel the warmest gratitude for your pathetic mediation on our behalf with the Crown." Man, good stuff. Neither the king nor Parliament proved inclined to reconsider the coercive acts. The tax burden against which the colonists were protesting was laughably small, and their righteousness was grating. Lord North, the Prime Minister, commissioned the famed essayist Samuel Johnson to write a response to the Continentals' complaints. Plainly, the easiest case to make against the colonists was to charge them with hypocrisy, as we continue to do today. In Taxation, No Tyranny, Johnson asked dryly, quote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" Johnson's opposition to slavery was far more than rhetorical. A free Jamaican, a black man named Francis Barber, was his companion, collaborator, and heir. Quote, "To the next insurrection of Negroes in the West Indies," Johnson declared in a toast he offered during the war. But Johnson's charge of hypocrisy amounted to no more than the charges made by Philadelphia doctor Benjamin Rush the year before. Where is the difference, Rush wondered, between the British senator who attempts to enslave his fellow subjects in America by imposing taxes upon them contrary to law and justice, and the American patriot who reduces his African brethren to slavery, contrary to justice and humanity? By now, the seed of anti-slavery, planted by Benjamin Lay, had borne fruit, and Quakers had formally banned slavery, excluding from membership anyone who claimed to own another human being. On April 14, 1775, 1 month before the Second Continental Congress was to meet in Philadelphia, 24 men, 17 of them Quakers, founded in that city the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes, unlawfully held in bondage. But once again, as in 1773, whatever the urgency of ending slavery, the attention of all the colonies was called away. 5 days later, on April 19th, 1775, blood spilled on the damp, dark grass of spring on Lexington Green. Lexington and Concord happens. Now, during this conflict, most colonists remained loyal to the king. If they supported resistance, it was to fight for their rights as Englishmen, not for their independence as Americans. Their slaves, though, fought a different fight. Quote, "It is imagined our governor has been tampering with the slaves, and he has in his contemplation to make great use of them in case of a civil war," young James Madison reported from Virginia to his friend William Bradford in Philadelphia. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, intended to offer freedom to slaves who would join the British Army. Quote, "To say the truth, that is the only part in which this colony is vulnerable," Madison admitted. "And if we should be subdued, we shall fall like Achilles by the hand of one that knows that secret." But the colonists' vulnerability to slave rebellion, that Achilles' heel, was hardly a secret. It defined them. Madison's own grandfather, Ambrose Madison, who had settled Montpelier, had been murdered by slaves in 1732, apparently poisoned to death when he was 36. In Madison's county, slaves had been convicted of poisoning their masters again in 1737 and 1746. In the first case, the convicted man was decapitated, his head placed atop a pole outside the courthouse to, quote, "deter others from doing the like." In the second poisoning, a woman named Eve was burned alive. Their bodies were made into monuments. No state was without this Achilles heel. George Washington's slaves had been running away at least since 1760. At least 47 of them fled at one time or another. In 1763, a 23-year-old man born in Gambia became Washington's property. Washington named him Harry and sent him to work draining a marsh known as the Great Dismal Swamp. In 1771, Harry Washington managed to escape, only to be recaptured. In November 1775, he was grooming his master's horses in the stables at Mount Vernon, where Lord Dunmore, that's the Virginia governor still follows the king, when Lord Dunmore made the announcement that Madison had feared. He offered freedom to any slaves who would join His Majesty's troops in suppressing the American rebellion. In Cambridge, where George Washington was assembling the Continental Army, he received a report about the slaves at Mount Vernon. Quote, "There is not a man of them but would leave us if they believed they could make their escape." Washington's cousin reported that winter, adding, quote, "Liberty is sweet." Harry Washington bided his time, but he would soon join the 500 men who ran from their owners and joined Lord Dunmore's forces, a number that included a man named Ralph, who ran away from Patrick Henry, and 8 of the 27 people owned by Peyton Randolph, who had served as president of the First Continental Congress. Edward Rutledge, a member of South Carolina's delegation of the Continental Congress, said that Dunmore's declaration did, quote, "more effectually work an eternal separation between Great Britain and the colonies than any other expedient which could possibly have been thought of. Not the taxes and the tea, not the shots at Lexington and Concord, not the siege of Boston itself, rather it was this act, Lord Dunmore's offer of freedom to slaves, that tipped the scales in favor of American independence." Not that it ever tipped them definitively. John Adams estimated that about a third of the colonists were patriots, a third were loyalists, people who support the king, and a third never really made a decision about independence. Aside from Dunmore's proclamation of freedom to slaves, the strongest impetus for independence came from brooding and tireless Thomas Paine, who immigrated to Philadelphia from England in 1774. In January 1776, Paine published an anonymous pamphlet called Common Sense, 47 pages of brisk political argument. Quote, as it is my design to make those who can scarcely read understand, Paine explained, I shall therefore avoid every literary ornament and put it in language as plain as the alphabet. Members of Congress might have been philosophers reading Locke and Montesquieu, but ordinary Americans read the Bible, Poor Richard's Almanac by Ben Franklin, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Paine wrote with fury, and he wrote with flash. Quote, the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind, he announced. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest, and will be more or less affected even to the end of time. His empiricism was homegrown, his metaphors those of the kitchen and the barnyard. Quote, there is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually or forever governed by an island, he wrote, turning the logic of English imperialism on its head. We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat. But he was not without philosophy. Digesting John Locke for everyday readers, Paine explained the idea of the state of nature. Quote, mankind being originally equals in the order of creation, the equality could only be destroyed by some subsequent circumstance, he wrote, a schoolteacher to his pupils. The rule of some over others, the distinctions between rich and poor, these forms of inequality were not natural, nor were they prescribed by religion. They were the consequences of actions and customs. And the most unnatural distinction of all, he explained, is the distinction of men into kings and subjects. Paine made use, too, of Magna Carta, the great charter of medieval England, arguing, the charter which secures this freedom in England was formed not in the Senate, but in the field, and insisted upon by the people, not granted by the crown. He urged Americans to write their own Magna Carta. But Magna Carta supplies no justification for outright rebellion. The best and most expedient strategy, Paine understood, was to argue not from precedent, which means stuff that happened before, or doctrine, but from nature. To insist that there exists a natural right to revolution, as natural as a child leaving its parent. Quote, let us suppose a small number of persons settled in some sequestered part of the earth, unconnected with the rest. They will then represent the first peopling of any country, or of the world, he began, as if he were telling a child a once-upon-a-time story. They will erect a government to secure their safety and their liberty. And when that government ceases to secure their safety and their liberty, it stands to reason that they may depose it. They retain this right forever. Much the same language found its way into resolutions passed by specially established colonial conventions, held so that the colonies, untethered from Britain, could establish new forms of government. Quote, all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. Read the Virginia Declaration of Rights and Form of Government, drafted in May 1776 by brazen George Mason. Quote, all power is vested in, and consequently derived from, the people. James Madison, half Mason's age, had been elected to that convention from Orange County, not California, but Virginia. He proposed a revision to Mason's declaration, where Mason had written that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. Madison rewrote that clause to instead guarantee that, quote, all men are equally entitled to the full and free exercise of it, being religion. The proposed change was adopted, and Madison became the author of the first ever constitutional guarantee of religious liberty, not as something to be tolerated, but as a fundamental right. Inevitably, slavery cast its long and terrible shadow over these statements of principle. Slavery, in fact, had made those statements of principle possible. Mason's original draft hadn't included the clause about rights being acquired by men, quote, when they enter into a state of society. These words were added after members of the convention worried that the original would, quote, have the effect of abolishing slavery. If all men belonging to civil society are free and equal, how can slavery be possible? It must be, Virginia's convention answered, that Africans do not belong to civil society, having never left a state of nature. Within 18th century political thought, women too existed outside the contract by which civil society was formed. From Massachusetts, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John, in March 1776, wondering whether that might be remedied. Quote, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors, she began, alluding to the long train of abuses of men over women. Quote, do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands, she told him. She spoke of tyranny. Quote, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. And she challenged John Adams to follow the logic of the principle of representation. Quote, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Her husband would have none of it. Quote, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh, he replied. Quote, we have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. That women were left out of the nation's founding documents and out of the founders' idea of civil society, considered, like slaves, to be confined to a state of nature, would trouble the political order for centuries to come. The Declaration explained what the colonists were fighting for. It was an attempt to establish that cause of the Revolution was that the king had placed his people under arbitrary power, reducing them to a state of slavery. Quote, the history of the present king of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. Many readers found these words unpersuasive. In 1776, the English philosopher and jurist Jeremy Bentham called the theory of government that informed the Declaration of Independence, quote, absurd and visionary. Its self-evident truths he deemed neither self-evident nor true. He considered them instead subversive of every actual or imaginable kind of government. But what Bentham found absurd and visionary represented the summation of centuries of political thought and political experimentation. The bulk of Jefferson's draft was a list of grievances, of charges against the king, calling him to account for, quote, imposing taxes on us without our consent, for dissolving the colonists' assemblies, for keeping a standing army, for depriving us of trial by jury, rights established as far back as Magna Carta. Then, in the longest statement in the draft, Jefferson blamed George III for African slavery, charging the king with waging, quote, cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery, preventing the colonies from outlawing the slave trade, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He, the king, is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us. This passage Congress got rid of, unwilling to conjure this assemblage of horrors in the nation's founding document. The declaration that Congress did adopt was a stunning rhetorical feat, an act of extraordinary political courage. It also marked a colossal failure of political will in holding back the tide of opposition to slavery by ignoring it for the sake of a union that in the end could not and would not last. making the Civil War perhaps inevitable. In July, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud from townhouses and street corners. Crowds cheered, cannons were fired, church bells rang, statues of the king were pulled down and melted for bullets. Weeks later, when a massive slave rebellion broke out in Jamaica, slave owners blamed the Americans for inciting it. In Pennsylvania, a wealthy merchant, passionately stirred by the spirit of the times, not only freed his slaves, but vowed to spend the rest of his life tracking down those he had previously owned and sold, and their children, and buying their freedom. And in August 1776, 1 month after delegates to the Continental Congress determined that in the course of human events it sometimes become necessary for one people to dissolve the bands which have connected them with another, Harry Washington declared his own independence by running away from Mount Vernon to fight with Dunmore's regiment, wearing a white sash stitched with the motto, "Liberty to slaves." During the war, nearly 1 in 5 slaves in the United States left their homes, fleeing American slavery in search of British liberty. One American refugee renamed himself British Freedom. New lyrics to Yankee Doodle, rewritten as the Negro's Farewell to America, were composed in London. In the new version, fugitive slaves leave the United States for old England, where liberty reigns, where no Negro, no beaten or loaded with chains. Not many succeeded in reaching the land where liberty reigned, or even in getting behind British battle lines. Instead, they were caught and punished. One slave owner who captured a 15-year-old girl who was heading for Dunmore's regiment punished her with 80 lashes, and then poured hot embers into the gashes. Jeez. Britain's forces were spread thin across the globe, waging the war on many fronts. For the British, the American Revolution formed merely one front in a much larger war, a war for empire, a world war. Like the French and Indian War, that war was chiefly fought in North America, but it spilled elsewhere too, to West Africa, South Asia, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean. The involvement of the French brought the fighting to the wealthy West Indies, where, beginning in 1778, the French captured the British colonies of Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, Montserrat, Tobago, St. Kitts, and Turks and Caicos. The cessation of trade between the mainland and the British Caribbean exacted another kind of toll on Britain's profitable sugar colonies. Africans starved to death. On Antigua alone, 1/5 of the slave population died during the war. To Americans, the Revolutionary War was not a world war, but a civil war, between those who favored independence and the many who did not. John Adams, offhand, guessed that 1 in 3 colonists remained loyal to the crown, and another third hadn't quite decided. But Adams' guess did not begin to include the still greater numbers of loyalists, whom the British counted among their allies. The entire population of American slaves, and nearly all Native American peoples. One reason the British continually failed to press their advantage was that they kept trying to change the field of fighting to a part of the colonies where they expected to find more loyalist support, not only among the merchants and lawyers and farmers who remained loyal to the crown, but among their African and Indian allies. The battle, General Howe's successor, Henry Clinton, believed, was to, quote, gain the hearts and subdue the minds of Americans. That strategy failed. And when that strategy failed, Britain didn't so much lose America as abandon it. At first, the crown courted compliance. In 1778, the king sent commissioners authorized to repeal all acts of parliament that had been opposed by the colonies since 1763. But when Congress demanded that the king recognize American independence, the commissioners refused. At this point, although General Clinton, held New York City and fighting continued to the west, the theater of war moved to the south. British ministers decided to make a priority of saving the wealthy sugar islands in the Caribbean, to give up on the northern and middle mainland colonies, to try to keep the southern colonies in order to restore the supply of food to the West Indies. Clinton captured Savannah, Georgia, in December 1778, and set his sights on Charleston, South Carolina, the largest city in the South. In Congress, this led to a debate about arming slaves. In May 1779, Congress proposed to enlist 3,000 slaves in South Carolina and Georgia, and to pay them with their freedom. Quote, "Your Negro battalion will never do," warned John Adams. Quote, "South Carolina would run out of their wits at the least hint of such a measure." He was entirely correct. The South Carolina legislature rejected the proposal, declaring, "We are much disgusted." Clinton then captured Charleston in May of 1780. I won't comment on that. In 1781, in hopes of taking the Chesapeake, that is the area around Virginia, the British general Lord Cornwallis fortified Yorktown, Virginia, as a naval base. His troops were soon besieged and bombarded by a combination of French and American forces. The French were led by the dazzling Marquis de Lafayette, whose service to the Continental Army and impassioned advocacy of the American cause had included lobbying for French support. Cornwallis was vulnerable because British naval forces were occupied in the Caribbean. He surrendered on October 19th, not realizing that British forces were that very day sailing from New York to aid him. Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown ended the fighting in North America, but it did not end the war. The real end for Great Britain came in 1782 in the West Indies, at the Battle of the Saints, when the British defeated a French and Spanish invasion of Jamaica, an outcome that testified not to the empire's weakness, but to its priorities. Britain no longer cares about the colonies in North America, they care about those sugar colonies in the West Indies. Britain kept the Caribbean, but gave up America. None were more desperate to escape the United States than the 15,000 to 20,000 ex-slaves who were part of that exodus, the largest emancipation in American history, before Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. In July of 1783, Harry Washington, who left Mount Vernon years before to join Dunmore's regiment, managed to reach New York City, where he boarded the British ship La Abondance, bound for Nova Scotia. A clerk noted his departure in a ledger called the Book of Negroes, listing the 2,775 runaway black men, women, and children who evacuated from the city with the British that summer. Harry Washington, 43, fine fellow, formerly the property of General Washington, left him 7 years ago. George Washington had in fact ordered the keeping of the Book of Negroes, so that owners might later seek compensation for slaves carried off in British ships. Runaway slaves suffered from exhaustion, they suffered from hunger, they suffered from disease. Of 30 people who escaped Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, that is his estate, 15 died of smallpox before reaching Cornwallis. Other fugitive slaves fled to the French. Quote, "We gained a veritable harvest of domestic slaves," wrote one surprised French officer. Armed slave patrols pursued the fugitives, capturing hundreds of Cornwallis' soldiers and their families, including 2 people owned by Washington and 5 owned by Jefferson. In the race to reach British lines, pregnant women, too, ran, in hopes that their newborns would earn their freedom papers in the form of a BB certificate, born free behind British lines. King, a carpenter, wrote in his memoirs that blacks in the city of New York were too frightened to even sleep. A Hessian, that is a German, officer reported that as many as 5,000 slave owners entered New York City to recapture their slaves. The revolution was at its most radical in the challenge it presented to the institution of slavery, and at its most conservative in its failure to meet that challenge. Still, the institution of slavery had begun to break, like a pane of glass streaked with cracks, but not yet shattered. In January 1783, when Lafayette heard that the commissioners in Paris were near to arriving at a peace treaty, he wrote to Washington to congratulate him and to propose that together they finish the work the revolution had begun. Quote, "Let us unite in purchasing a small estate, where we may try the experiment to free the Negroes," he suggested. Quote, "Such an example as yours might render it a general practice, and if we succeed in America, they could bring the experiment to the West Indies." Quote, "I should be happy to join you in so laudable or admirable a work," Washington wrote back, saying that he wished to meet to discuss the details. No thinking person was unaffected by the challenge the struggle for liberty posed to the institution of slavery, America's Achilles heel. In Philadelphia in 1783, James Madison, leaving Congress, was packing up, preparing to return to his estate at Montpelier. He wasn't sure what to do about Billy, a 23-year-old man that he'd brought with him from Virginia when he first come to serve in Congress. Billy had been Madison's property since his birth in 1759, when Madison was 8 years old. In 1777, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the first abolition law in the Western world, decreeing that any child born to an enslaved woman after March 1st, 1780, would be free after 28 years of slavery, and banning the sale of slaves. New York's John Jay declared that to oppose emancipation would be to find of America that, quote, her prayers to heaven for liberty would be impious. In 1782, the Virginia legislature passed a law that allowed slave owners to free their slaves. One Virginia Quaker said upon manumitting, that is, freeing his slaves, that he had been fully persuaded that freedom is the natural right of all mankind, and that it is my duty to do unto others as I would desire to be done that I would like to be done to me in the like situation. Not many followed his lead. In 1782, Madison had bought a cache of books in Philadelphia, including a copy of Hobbes' Leviathan. Even though short of cash and complaining that he would soon be under the necessity of selling a Negro, meaning Billy. The terrible irony of the man who would draft the Constitution selling a man to buy philosophy was prevented by the terms of Pennsylvania's 1780 abolition law. Madison could not, in fact, sell Billy in Philadelphia. And in 1783, as he prepared to leave Philadelphia for Virginia, it was by no means certain, under Pennsylvania law, that he had any legal right to force Billy to go with him either. Quote, I have judged it most prudent not to force Billy back to Virginia, even if it could be done, Madison reported to his father. Quote, I am persuaded his mind is too thoroughly tainted to be a fit companion for fellow slaves in Virginia. That is, Billy, having spent 3.5 years serving Madison in Philadelphia, a city where many black people were free, would be a problem on a plantation. He would incite rebellion. Trade in slaves was illegal in Pennsylvania. Madison might have tried to smuggle Billy out of the state, to sell him farther south or into the Caribbean. But he told his father he was unwilling to, quote, think of punishing him by transportation merely for coveting that liberty for which we have paid the price of so much blood, and have proclaimed so often to be the right and worthy pursuit of every human being. In the end, Madison decided to sell him, not as a slave, but as an indentured servant, with a 7-year term. Billy renamed himself William Gardner, served out his 7-year term, became a free man, worked as merchant's agent, and raised a family with a wife who, when Jefferson was in Philadelphia, washed Jefferson's clothes. The terms of the peace cut the number of African slaves in Britain's empire in half, which meant that the anti-slavery movement in England gained a more attentive audience, and the pro-slavery lobby was vastly weakened. Quite the reverse applied in the United States. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, slave owners in states like South Carolina gained political power, while slave owners in the West Indies lost it. West Indian planters were outraged by Britain's decision to forbid trade between the islands and the United States, a decision that led to riots. A sizable number of the freed slaves who left the United States for other parts of the British Empire ended up in the Caribbean. In Jamaica, they began demanding the right to vote. They argued that taxation without representation was tyranny. In the end, the American challenge to empire contributed to a political and moral critique of slavery that was felt far more deeply in the British Empire than in the United States. The peace made, George Washington rode on a gray horse into the city of New York, where a flag of 13 stripes and stars had been raised on a pole in Battery Park. Only hours before, the British flag had waved. The last British troops had left the city, occupied since 1776. The last British ship not quite out of sight. The city erupted in jubilation as Washington and his soldiers rode down Broadway. That night, Washington went to a tavern for a public dinner, where he raised his wine glass and offered 13 toasts to the new nation, to liberty, to America's allies, and more. Quote, "To the memory of those heroes who have fallen for our freedom. And may America be an asylum to the persecuted of the earth. And finally, may the remembrances of this day be a lesson to kings. England would have no slaves, and America would have no king." And that's the end of this very interesting reading on liberty and slavery around the American Revolution. Thanks for listening. Have a great day and a great life.